whole idea of rebooting a franchise with a new director and new actors and a whole new creative approach was kind of unheard of.
And I think that they could have gone one of two ways. Way one was, let's play it safe. And way two was, let's just completely and totally entrust somebody to take this and make it their own.
Warner's is looking to make another Batman film, and I was like, I don't think there's any world in which Chris would be interested in that. And he was like, no, that's really exciting, because I've always thought there was a Batman story that hasn't been told on film.
The pitch that Chris had was it was quick. It was 10 or 15 minutes, but it was so holistic. And it really was Batman Begins.
Chris came in and said, look, this is what I want to do in the movie. This is what I want to do with it visually. This is where I think the character needs to go. I think it's going to be different than any superhero movie anybody's seen before. And we looked at each other and I said, look, if you're going to back a guy off a pitch, I think this is a guy to do it with.
Chris, at that point, had only really made 3 feature films. You have to hand it to the Suits for saying, well, I'd rather go with someone who has absolute clarity and confidence in what they're doing than someone who's basically just going to sit at the table and give us exactly what we expect. Because we tried that before, and it didn't really work.
To hear that Christopher Nolan was doing it, that made me very excited.
That's the real leap that happened when Batman Begins came out. This is definitely not made in a boardroom. This is like someone's point of view on this.
We weren't making a movie necessarily to drive consumer products. Even to the extent that we weren't really making a Batman movie, we were making a Chris Nolan movie.
Action films tend largely to be a genre aimed at offering identification with a protagonist who physically masters the world around him or her and feeds into simplistic, omnipotent fantasy. For this reason, a majority are simply puerile and few escape the confines of being films for pleasure. The Christopher Nolan Batman films transcend genre expectations. They offer richness of character and ideas even if they appear to be superficially just action spectacles. I will argue that the films were successful both because of and in spite of the intelligence and thought which went into making them, and the ideologies they explore, express, and even exploit. Both films meet and in some ways set big budget Hollywood standards in terms of technical production in everything from the score and sound to visual effects and cinematography. Yet, the filmmakers found a way to incorporate emotional, psychological, political, and moral significance. The rebirth of the Batman franchise by Christopher Nolan had brought films which are clearly a result of the same creative minds. But, whereas the first film is focused primarily on the personal, psychological birth and evolution of a man who dresses up as a bat to fight crimes, the second is wider in scope, looking at the existence of the Batman within a political and social context. The films were critically and commercially well received, but The Dark Knight proved to be so successful on both accounts that Batman Begins has almost been demoted to merely being a scene compositor for a superior sequel. However, I think that the first film has significant merits that warrant examination as a work in and of itself. The psychological plausibility that the film offers can be demonstrated best by treating the character of Bruce Wayne as a textual case study, to whom we can apply psychoanalytic theory. One of the most interesting themes of the film is the exploration of omnipotence and the opposite sides of the same coin, impotence, and how this feeds into Bruce Wayne's development and thoughts about crime. Freud posited that all babies are born thinking of themselves as representing the universe. Children continue to fantasize about and struggle to come to terms with omnipotence or the lack thereof, and true maturity in adulthood can be represented by an understanding of the real power one possesses, which is likely to be comparatively small but important, genuine rather than imagined or wished for, and partially acquiescent. In dealing with these issues while still a child, a person will project this sense of omnipotence onto their guardians, in part to help relieve themselves from the stress of the dangers of the world, and this projection of power is usually focused most prominently on the father. Batman Begins presents Bruce Wayne as a child in very much this state of mind. The view of his father is as an entirely idealized paternal being. He is unable to grow out of this fantasy of his father's perfection due to the immortalization of the image caused by the killing of the father and arrested development of Bruce's omnipotence complex. This omnipotence and its twin, impotence, occupies Bruce's view of himself. He blames himself for his parents' death in a moving scene in which he declares his misplaced sense of responsibility while simultaneously being utterly powerless to stop it.
It was my fault, Alfred. I made them leave the theater. If I hadn't gotten scared.
It was nothing that you did. It was him. And him alone.
Then finds a new father figure in the form of Ducard, who seems to offer him the solution of actual omnipotence by turning him into nothing short of a super being, and it is Ducard who recognizes Bruce's omnipotence fantasy.
What you really fear is inside yourself. You fear your own power. You fear your anger, the drive to do great, terrible things.
Ducard understands Bruce's misguided but psychologically natural assumption to blame himself.
You have learned to bury your guilt with anger. I will teach you to confront it and to face the truth.
Ducard tells him that not only was the death of his father not Bruce's fault, but that it was actually his father's fault. The effect this has is to directly confront Bruce's omnipotence fantasy, not by addressing him, but by tainting the image of paternal perfection, which sits behind this fantasy and is utterly intertwined with it. The truth content about this statement is questionable, of course, blaming the victim of violent crime for not acting to defend himself successfully, but the power of this statement is to shake the foundations of Bruce's arrested development in relation to his father, releasing the unconscious guilt associated with his father, who is in Bruce's mind omnipotent. This can then in turn liberate him, allowing him to disassociate himself entirely from the blame of the murder and allow him to grow out of his omnipotence fantasy and begin to realize his true power, which he can learn to master and indeed inflate in his enemies' eyes through manipulation of his environment. This psychological growth also allows him to defy Ducard, his new mentor and father figure, and indeed Bruce's true understanding of his well-honed powers and skills allows him also to save Ducard in the face of certain death, in some way atoning for his inability to do this for his actual father. Following on from this, Bruce's psychological development allows him to seek father figures who represent qualities of intelligence, dignity, and kindness in the form of Alfred, Lucius Fox, and James Gordon. His search for a replacement father figure is ongoing, but is now kept in check by Bruce's own moral development and his understanding of his real father.
Years I wanted to kill him. Now I can't.
Batman Begins explores the debilitating psychological effects of violent crime on the victim and the mental strain and impeding repercussions of living in fear. The killing of Bruce Wayne's parents, a significant aspect of Tim Burton's 1989 movie, is depicted in a clipped, almost perfunctory scene. Instead, here we dwell on the killing's aftermath, and the film also explores various factors which cause crime, mostly focused on the social poverty and extreme economic inequality, and the psychological fear. As Bruce's father is quick to point out following Bruce's fall, an encounter with the bats.
You know why they attacked you, don't you? They were afraid of you.
Afraid of him?
All creatures feel fear.
Even the scary ones.
Especially the scary ones.
Gentlemen, time to spread the word. And the word is
Violence, aggression, and intimidation is viewed as a product of the projection of one's own fears, insecurities, and perceived victimhood. The finale of the film, in which the narrows of Gotham City are caked in toxic weaponized fear gas, demonstrates this by having the inhabitants of the street turn on each other violently rather than everyone cowering in the corner.
Parents deserve justice.
You're not talking about justice, you're talking about revenge.
Sometimes they're the same.
No, they're never the same, Bruce. Justice is about harmony, revenge is about you making yourself feel better. That is why we have an impartial system.
Oh, your system is broken.
Despite examining these causes, the film takes an unequivocal zero-tolerance view of crime and does not subscribe to the notion that because it might be partially a result of poverty and inequality, that the criminals themselves are blameless, and that instead the fault lies with the system. To quote Joe Chill, the murderer of Bruce Wayne's parents, who directly references this form of thinking in his speech to the court prior to his release from prison.
Your Honor, not a day goes by that I don't wish I could take back what I did. Sure, I was desperate, like a lot of people back then, but that don't change what I did.
The approach to dealing with crime that the film most consistently appraises is expressed through the voice of Descartes while mentoring Bruce Wayne.
Criminals thrive on the indulgence of society's understanding. Like you, I was forced to learn there are those without decency who must be fought without hesitation, without pity.
Batman's central personal philosophy and purpose can be summed up in his own words: to turn fear against those who would prey on the fearful. As a child, he came face to face with aggression, intimidation, and violence, and the psychologically paralyzing effects of inaction and impotence have haunted him since. It is the antithesis of this to which he aspires and dedicates himself, to be able to be proactive and definitive when faced with an aggressor, and to do this on behalf of those who are unable to. He immerses himself in criminal life to try to come to terms with criminal mentality on the basis that knowledge reduces fear.
You've traveled the world to understand the criminal mind and conquer your fears. But the criminal is not complicated.
And his subsequent training with Descartes is geared towards having both the mental strength to overcome fear and the physical skills which allow him to change the balance of power in his favor, out-intimidate his opponent, and wrestle control of the situation from the instigator and perpetrator of the aggression. Wayne consciously knits his neurosis into a weaponized identity so as to fight fear with fear. This offers a degree of psychological plausibility. That is why it is little wonder that the working script for Batman Begins was given the name Intimidation Game. Intriguingly, this is the central tenet of a whole stream of reality-based martial arts, which have become more popular in the last few years, and which often incorporate pressure testing drills to simulate a real-life violent encounter to try to address the mental as well as physical strains of conflict. One of the successes of the film, in my opinion, is the articulation through the creation by Bruce Wayne of Batman of the fear, perhaps particularly a male one, of the potential inability to act appropriately to defend oneself or loved ones when faced with the threat of physical confrontation. As per Tyler Durden's philosophy in Fight Club, individuals have not been faced with a war against which to test themselves, so most remain untested their whole lives.
We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no Great War, no Great Depression. Our Great War is a spiritual war. Our Great Depression is our lives.
This is both a blessing and a curse, as we live in fear of potential impotence that may one day be revealed. Batman Begins taps into this angst and layers it with psychoanalytic overtones, which are intertwined with this fear. There is often a lie told by the society that the issue around which this angst is focused, whether one will be able to do what is necessary when faced with confrontation, is representative of the real person, while the rituals of inauthenticity are dropped in times of extreme danger. We should not be convinced that the real person is not what one is every day, and that this is forever hidden unless confronted by an immediate violent threat, or indeed that the real person is not represented by how one acts in other important times of need, such as comforting a loved one in bereavement, or dealing with a threat which is real but not immediate and requires analysis and strategy rather than physical prowess to counter. To illustrate this in the film, the split between Bruce Wayne and Batman is necessitated. Bruce creates for himself a superficial playboy personality which prevents him from being able to offer the kind of support required by Rachel in her everyday life beyond her limited but important need for protection from violence. This is most obviously demonstrated in a friendly but chastising comment to him as they meet in the hotel that he has just decided to buy.
It's not who you are underneath. It's what you do that defines you.
By the end of the film, Rachel recognizes that all Bruce's energy is devoted to ensuring defense and protection against physical aggression, and has to tell him that they cannot be together until he's able to give Batman up. The devotion to conquering the fear of impotence requires too much of Bruce, and he has to sacrifice being a regular supportive person of the kind that she needs in real relationship to continue to offer support to those in extreme circumstances. In other words, Bruce sacrifices engagement in a mature, intimate relationship. This sacrifice is re-evaluated and put to test in The Dark Knight. Having carefully articulated the psychological factors which will lead to Bruce's philosophy of out-intimidating aggressors, the film takes certain cautions to ensure that Bruce can differentiate himself and his actions morally from those he seeks to fight. This is partly arrived at and explored through the notion of justice, and it is Rachel Dawes' character which is central to Bruce's development in this area. It is she who invokes Bruce's father, stating that he would be ashamed of Bruce when the latter attempts and fails to exact revenge for his parents' death by killing Joe Chill. It is Rachel who's unequivocal that revenge and justice are never the same thing, clearly in direct contrast to the eye for an eye philosophy. She acknowledges that while the criminal justice system is not perfect, it is morally superior to simple retaliation and vigilantism. These are the teachings which Bruce takes with him to the Far East, which he invokes and allows him to resist Descartes' philosophy.
So my pitch was, at the time, let's treat this with some sense of reality, more like not so much a comic book movie as an action film. Really the idea of an extraordinary character in an ordinary world. Rather than, what Tim had done was this very extraordinary world where Batman sort of made sense. We wanted to have kind of the Dick Donner treatment, where it's like you've got a relatively ordinary, recognizable reality and then this extraordinary figure. Try not to separate my love for very sophisticated, esoteric filmmakers, people I grew up watching, like Nicholas Roeg, whose films I love. I try not to separate that side of myself from the side that grew up watching Star Wars and James Bond and loving that. You try to pitch the film in the language that you think it should be made in. You try and think of what's the breadth of the audience you're making the film for. But I don't think that needs to involve dumbing it down or selling it out in any way, because I grew up loving Hollywood blockbusters, and for me it's really a process of trying to recreate that magic, that sense of scale, that sense of immersion in a world that you grew up with. If you can bring that to filmmaking, I think you have the potential to reach a wider audience. In expanding the story, we had almost a little bit of a genre shift. We went to a sort of a big crime story, a grand city story that involves, you know, the law enforcement, the criminal community, the judicial system, people working outside the law, all of these things coming together. The opportunity you get with working in a particular genre, like the action movie genre, the superhero genre, working within a genre, it allows you, affords you the opportunity to explore things you're interested in or afraid of, neurosis you have, worries you have about the way the world is. It allows you to explore them in a very sort of exaggerated manner, in a way that you can really tap into the collective fears that we have as a society. And particularly in the case of Batman, you have the opportunity through his environment, through Gotham, to really offer a very dark reflection of the society we live in. And
for us, you know, one of, I think, society's most palpable fears is the fear of the collapse to anarchy, the idea of people in society who will not in any way be bound by any kind of convention, whether that of society or even the convention of criminal society within the larger society.
But I think that there's an overriding sense in which Batman and who Batman is and how people respond to him that is actually the sort of defining feature of the story, and I think by the end that becomes clear that it's very much Batman's story as the title would suggest. We were trying to figure out, how do you move on from what you've done in Batman Begins? How do you make the film bigger and more than Batman Begins without compromising the story and the characters and everything? And I wanted to push further and further in the direction of shooting on location and shooting with a real world scale, because even with some of the interiors, you know, the office spaces or boardrooms and things like that, the biggest set you could possibly build isn't going to be as big as the real world version of it. And so shooting on real locations, you're able to get some of that scope and scale very naturally and organically into the film. And it felt to me that Gotham had to become this huge arena in the movie for these characters to face off in.
It's not necessarily about a direct reality, because I think the films are extremely heightened and they're extremely operatic, but it's about what I suppose you might term as cinematic reality. It's about giving the world of the films and the characters as much weight and validity as they would if your source material were not a comic book. If he was a character in another genre of film that you were having to introduce to the audience for the first time and get them to believe in. That's really what my use of the word reality is about. It's not about a literal reality. Part of the appeal of the world of Gotham is that it is not real life. It is removed from real life, and so you can address dramatic elements that would be extremely uncomfortable in a realistic film in a way that lets the audience enjoy the experience and the entertainment, but hopefully gives them a little something to think about and gets under their skin in some ways.
On its release, a common piece of praise for The Dark Knight was that one would come out of the theatre exhausted. This was generally held to be partly because the film had a number of very exciting and tremendously executed action scenes, but that an ovation also transpired because of the emotional turmoil that was induced in the audience. The film plays out a series of moral conundrums and inconceivably difficult psychological choices which the characters must deal with, and with which we also struggle. Christopher Nolan had grown so expert at the filmmaking process that he was able to create the blend of visual imagery and musical score to create something mesmerizing and almost hypnotic, much like Michael Mann, a conscious and stated influence on the director and his film. The skillful manipulation of different story strands means that Nolan creates a climax in which the stakes and level of excitement could hardly be higher, as Batman must catch the Joker, deal with his assailants, save the hostages, confront the police who are unaware of the Joker's double cross, and deal with the knowledge that two boats are engineered to explode, and that Harvey Dent has kidnapped Gordon's family, all whilst coping with the grief of losing Rachel and potentially alienating Lucius.
To them, you're just a freak. Like me. They need you right now. But when they don't, they'll cast you out.
The skill is also directed to addressing the ethical themes of the film, primarily the analysis of the clash of competing moral philosophies. The Dark Knight, like most mainstream cinema, carries and supports an ideological agenda.
We need Lau back. But the Chinese won't extradite a national under any circumstances.
If I get him to you, can you get him to talk?
I'll get him to sing.
Batman operates outside of the law and outside of the bounds of accountability to the institution and civilization he serves.
So he hasn't shown up?
He often doesn't. I like reminding everybody that he's out there.
Why wouldn't he come?
Hopefully. Because he's busy.
He is the individual hero who is willing to do the right thing, which is whatever is necessary to stop the enemies of the society he serves.
Know your limits, Master Wayne.
Batman has no limits.
The Batman is an outlaw. But that's not why we're demanding he turn himself in. We're doing it because we're scared. We've been happy to let the Batman clean up our streets for us until now.
The liberal politician Harvey Dent, working within the law using the social institutions to which he is held accountable, appears to offer the promise of a solution to the crime and security threats that plague the city.
The head guys make bail, sure, but the mid-level guys, they can't. They can't afford to be off the streets long enough for trial and appeal. They'll cut deals that include some jail time. Think of all you could do with 18 months of clean streets.
It turns out, however, that under extreme pressure his resolve is discovered to be hopeless. His promises are empty and he's morally bankrupt and two-faced.
You thought we could be decent men in an indecent time!
The people, although they did not know it, need a hero willing to work outside the bounds of accountability or the need for popularity, and so they are lied to for their own good. While I believe the aforementioned is essentially an accurate one, we could find ourselves too easily dismissing the film, which does examine some interesting themes because its basic ideological premise is found wanting, and I will try to address some of them in this video.
With all of the major story movements of The Dark Knight, we've tried to imbue them with a sense of inevitability. You really want kind of in the first reel to set up a set of expectations and feelings about the type of story that you're going to see and the way in which these things are going to play out for these characters. But hopefully we'll try and, surprise people in terms of how those things come to pass.
I have always thought the claim that superheroes were the modern equivalent of classic mythology to be a suggestion which demonstrates more of a lack of understanding about the organic development of mythology than a useful statement. However, there is certainly a sense of the epic and emotional quality of classical mythology in The Dark Knight. Nolan himself recognizes this in interviews. Superheroes fill a gap in the pop culture psyche, similar to the role of Greek mythology. There isn't really anything else that does the job in modern terms. For me, Batman is the one that can most clearly be taken seriously. He's not from another planet or filled with radioactive gunk. I mean, Superman is essentially a god, but Batman is more like Hercules. He is a human being, very flawed, and bridges the divide.
Batman is not a simple heroic figure, and that's the reason I was interested in him of all superheroes, because he has no superpowers. He is the most human of superheroes, therefore, and I think he's very, very flawed, and I think that the more that those flaws are allowed to just bubble under the surface, you know, underneath the sort of triumphalism, I think that makes things, I think it makes it more like real life, frankly. One of the story elements I'm continually drawn to is that the protagonist who suffers, I think if that comes from inside themselves somehow, if they are somehow responsible for their own predicament, I find that very evocative. I find that very, very much more moving than if it's as simple as, oh, well, here's a bad guy and he's doing bad things. Not to get too pretentious, but from Shakespeare and all the rest, that's something that has struck a chord with me. It's this idea that if the seeds of your own destruction really are internal, they really are coming from inside yourself, it heightens everything and heightens the sense of tragedy to do with everything. In the case of Batman and this story, it's a question of finding the positivity in it. It's a question of saying, here's a character, like the protagonists of my other films, I think, who is driven by extraordinarily negative things. But what makes him a heroic figure, and it's something we had to constantly bear in mind, is the fact that he's able to channel these negative impulses into something positive, into something altruistic, something relating to helping other people rather than just the notion of personal vengeance. The interesting thing about Batman as a figure is that he's driven by very, very dark things. There's a lot of rage, a lot of anger that really, really motivates him, but he's trying to channel that into something good. But he's really playing with fire. You know, he's working outside the law. He's doing all kinds of very questionable things, but in the service of good. That really is playing with fire. That really is riding this knife edge.
A limited definition of mythology might describe such stories as the exploration of serious human and social issues through extreme characters in high drama. Certainly, we can see parallels in The Dark Knight to the moral conundrums of Vigilante or Antigone. The following examples will corroborate the aforesaid. First, Bruce Wayne's turmoil as to whether to turn himself in to stop the Joker killings. Second, the decision to save either Harvey Dent or Rachel Dawes following the Joker's kidnapping of them. Third, the dilemma of the passengers on the boat, whether to destroy the other vessel as per the Joker's twisted game. Fourth, the emotional torture by Dent of Gordon as he asks him to choose a family member to be sacrificed. What sets The Dark Knight apart from other comic book adaptations in its claims to characterize modern mythology is that it has a richness of ideas, nuance and ambiguity in its application to the real world. I will now look to explore some of these ideas and themes. At its core, The Dark Knight explores and plays out the clash of competing moral philosophies held by its main characters.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker is one of a character obsessed with creating anarchy.
Introduce a little anarchy. Upset the established order, and everything becomes chaos.
A man hell-bent on undermining the sanity and perceived values of others.
I'm an agent of chaos.
He defines his ideal worldview as society and individuals in chaos, and steers his will and actions to ensure the realization of this. He wants to demonstrate that even those who consider themselves centered and upstanding really have a value system based on porcelain gods and are at heart, if purged, animals. Animals who are subject to base and selfish needs, which illustrates a Hobbesian worldview. Despite his claims to the contrary, his attempts to create chaos and instill a nihilistic sense of morality in those he targets is extremely well organized. His dedication to his goal is unstoppable as he demonstrates his resistance to reason, negotiation, aggression, and pleading throughout the film. The disfigured Harvey Dent is transformed into a representative of an extreme form of relativism, where all alternatives have equal moral weight, so decisions about life and death can and should be left to chance, the flip of a coin. Nihilism and moral relativism in extreme forms, which one might argue are really one and the same, as true moral relativism is not really any kind of morality at all. These are depicted as clearly negative and the key ethical philosophies against which our protagonist must fight. Bruce Wayne has no shortage of competing moral guardians opposed to the Joker and Two-Face, which he can turn to and must decide between.
I was meant to inspire good, not madness, not death.
Batman questions himself and his own moral standing. He represents, after all, a vigilante ethos, in which he acts and operates outside of the law, and as he tells Harvey Dent, this is not what he believes Gotham needs in the long term.
You can't give in. You can't give in!
Batman is not willing, however, to do absolutely anything at all in order to stop the Joker. Whilst he's tested, he does not break his one rule. He refuses to kill the Joker in order to stop him. He does finally capture the Joker, saving his life in the process, and also preventing him from being killed by the police.
Yeah, well, good thing about the mob is they keep giving you second chances.
Prior to his disfigurement, Harvey is a political idealist. He respects and defends Batman, comparing his defense of Gotham to Julius Caesar in the Roman Republic.
When their enemies were at the gates, the Romans would suspend democracy and appoint one man to protect the city. And it wasn't considered an honor, it was considered a public service. Okay, fine. You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
However, this idealism also brings him into conflict with Batman.
One day, the Batman will have to answer for the laws he's broken.
And with Lieutenant Gordon as well, who shares a similar moral outlook but has a different approach in which he acknowledges the practical difficulties of idealism by telling Harvey the following.
I didn't work with cops you'd investigated while you were making your name at IAIP working alone. I don't get political points for being an idealist. I have to do the best I can with what I have.
Alfred. Why is he letting Harvey do this?
He went down to the press conference.
I know, and he just stood by.
The characters of Alfred and Rachel represents a direct conflict of ideas about how to deal with the terror wrought by the Joker. Whilst Rachel initially tells Bruce that he cannot give in to the Joker's demands to turn himself in, she later berates Bruce whilst in discussion with Alfred because he allowed Harvey Dent to falsely turn himself in as the Batman. In short, when pushed, Rachel represents appeasement when confronted with the demands of a criminal. Alfred, however, insists that Bruce must be willing to do what is necessary.
Endure, Master Wayne. Take it. They'll hate you for it, but that's the point of Batman. He can be the outcast. He can make the choice that no one else can make. The right choice.
He is critical of Bruce's intention to give in to the Joker's demands and tells Rachel that
Perhaps both Bruce and Mr. Dent believe that Batman stands for something more important than the whims of a terrorist restores.
Alfred's philosophy can be summed up by his recital of his own experiences of dealing with a psychopathic killer. When Bruce recites his teachings from Descartes from the first film, the criminals are not complicated, Alfred retorts,
Perhaps this is a man you don't fully understand either. A long time ago, I was in Burma. My friends and I were working for the local government. They were trying to buy the loyalty of tribal leaders by bribing them with precious stones. But their caravans were being raided in a forest north of Rangoon by a bandit. So we went looking for the stones. But in 6 months, we never met anyone who traded with him. One day, I saw a child playing with a ruby the size of a tangerine. The bandit had been throwing them away.
So why steal them?
Well, because he thought it was good sport. Because some men aren't looking for anything logical, like money. They can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. Some men just want to watch the world burn.
When asked by Bruce if the bandit was ever caught, he replies,
We burned the forest down.
That is why Alfred represents an extreme philosophy of refusal to compromise about defeating criminals. This is really zero tolerance. Interestingly, the other characters in the film are shown to promote and condone Rachel's position are the people of Gotham in general, with whom Harvey must defend his anti-appeasement stance. Beyond the mob, the only other characters to outwardly condone appeasement in the film are Barbara Gordon, who blames Batman for the apparent death of her husband at the Joker's hands.
Are you okay? Are you? You brought this craziness on us! You did! You brought this on us!
And Coleman Reese, who manages to find himself victimized even when he intends to act bravely by trying to blackmail Bruce Wayne and then reveal his identity on television. Lucius acts as less of a moral theorist for Bruce and the viewer, but more as a watchful eye, offering checks and balances to any extreme avenue Bruce or Batman may look to pursue. This is most evident near the end of the film when Lucius threatens to resign after being shown Bruce's most recent research and development instrument, and can only be convinced to help Bruce on the condition that the surveillance machine is destroyed after it has served its purpose. The film posits a challenge to any simple interpretation of utilitarianism as a moral philosophy that can be used as a guide to action. Utilitarianism might be crudely summed up in the following statement: the most moral action is the one which brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people, and the least moral action being the inverse of this. The Dark Knight explores the limitations of this by demonstrating the impossibility of predicting accurately the unintended consequences of actions, as every decision that Batman, Gordon and Harvey make seems to end up being leveraged by the Joker to further support his vicious schemes. But the Dark Knight also suggests an interesting challenge to the very notion of utilitarianism, most obviously with the Joker's plan involving the two boats. The utilitarian position would be to argue that the most moral action as a passenger on one of the boats would be to blow the other up, as this will lead to a lower death toll than if they do nothing, in which case both would be blown up. The film suggests that such an act is inhumane, despite the advantage in numbers it yields on this theoretical moral tally. The film instead celebrates the moral strength of the prisoner who refuses to play the game and throws the detonator overboard. The scene suggests that the only true moral course of action is that which will actually lead to the greatest loss of life. On the boat with the regular citizens, they vote to blow the other one up, but when it comes to it, no one is strong enough to go through with pulling the trigger, and we are invited to celebrate this strength of will, a theme at the forefront of both Batman Begins and The Dark Knight. This theme is also problematized and demonstrated to not necessarily be a good in itself.
I'm sorry, Harvey.
Batman as a character is presented in the film with the two evils of nihilism and moral relativism, and the psychological torment with which we are asked to identify is in choosing how he deals with these threats. He is pulled in different directions by the other main characters: legal versus illegal, idealism versus realism, and appeasement versus victory at all costs. It is this turmoil, the difficulty of the decision-making process, that we are invited to share. However, Batman's wrestling with this has not gone down well with some critics who do not welcome the uncertainty and lack of moral clarity. David Thompson writes that Batman is supposedly a creature of great purpose, but his moral logic is often unclear and confused, as when he's repeatedly told that by provoking terrorists he's responsible for the deaths of innocents, a lie which he apparently believes. I have sympathy with this view, as in too much of today's critical and analytical writing ambiguity is viewed as a good in itself. We should bear in mind that ambiguity, for its own sake, is the same as saying nothing. At no time in the film is it ever suggested that the Joker is anything but evil. His nihilistic view of the world is clearly represented as abhorrent and utterly destructive to humanity. Whilst his nihilism may make him interesting and appealing, even saying that he represents a morally grey area is not supported by the film at all, as he's never portrayed as anything other than a mass-murdering psychopath. This is equally true of Two-Face and his extreme relativist position of morality as chance. Once he takes up this philosophy, he's clearly demonstrated to be a repugnant human being with no compunction about killing an innocent child among many other victims. So, at a high level, the morality of the film is quite clear. Batman is not responsible for the Joker's actions, and the Joker has earned no reason for us to trust that he will stop the killing. One might, however, have sympathy and identify with the sense of difficulty in reaching moral clarity in a way that is not primitive in its simplicity, and value the film's reserve about providing simple maxims for how to act in extreme circumstances.